Welcome everybody to the artificial plane surface dilemma town hall discussion. So I want to thank all the participants for coming and taking the middle of your day to learn more about the latest science and to be able to have an opportunity to ask your questions to help remove any confusion that you may have on the safety for the artificial plane surfaces. We will have today Kristen Dubin to help be our chat moderator. And so she will be monitoring the chat for your questions or any comments or problems. And let me know when we need to address those. Astrid, she will be our timekeeper. And of course, we have our wonderful guest speakers that I will be introducing you to shortly. I'm Tamala Trussell. I am the founder of Move Past Plastic. We're a grassroots organization and we work with national and international partners as well as local partners to address single-use plastic and their issues. And we recognize that plastic actually equates to chemicals. And it's those chemical toxicities as well as the microplastics that break down that are creating the harms around us. So I am going to take this moment to do a screen share. Astrid is going to enter into the chat a Mentimeter URL, and we will go through the different questions for this Mentimeter, and just to get to know you guys a little bit more and find out how you feel about the synthetic plane surfaces, and then we'll introduce our guest panelist at that time. All right, so I'm going to do a screen share so we can all see what's happening with our Mentimeter together. The first question is how your has your community installed, or do they plan to install artificial plane surfaces? That's what APS stands for, acronym. So when you see that, it's just easier instead of typing artificial plane surfaces. So we'll just refer to it as APS. So this would include artificial turf playing fields, poured in place playgrounds, other rubberized playgrounds, or rubberized tiles. And that can also include something that people don't often think about is your local workout facility. Like my YMCA has rubberized floors throughout probably 4 or more different rooms to work out on. And Astrid, if you can repopulate that in URL in the chat, people, when they come in late, they're not able to see it in the chat. Okay, so it's looking, you're welcome to continue to fill that out. We're going to go to the next question. It looks like most of you have already existing artificial fields of or playing surfaces in your communities. Okay, so the next section is to rate the following field selection criteria. So which of these attributes are the most important to you when determining what kind of playing surface you would like to install in your communities? And Astrid, if you want to just put it in one more time, the Mentimeter URL. If you haven't already done so, just click on the URL and then you will be able to answer the questions on the Mentimeter here. So we can kind of see what everybody's interests are. Okay, so far for this one, it looks like maintenance and player safety are some of the bigger factors that are taken into consideration when choosing a synthetic playing field. All right, last question. What information would alter your decision to choose alternatives to artificial playing surfaces? So are there specific, any specific information that would help move your persuasion from installing an artificial playing surface to a natural alternative? What would that be?
Pamela, there's a question. Somebody's asking, what does player recruitment mean?
Player recruitment, it means I've heard from many high school coaches and athletic directors that they are choosing to put down the artificial playing surfaces because their students aren't being recruited because they're not playing on the artificial playing turf. And also having the experience playing on that artificial turf will help them to be a better player when they go to college where those artificial turfs are installed, so that their experience level, because when you play on an artificial turf field, it's very different from a natural field, and the ball and running and different aspects of it are very different. So that's one of the rationales that I've heard. Thank you, Astrid, and whoever asked that question, I appreciate it. We'll take about 30 more seconds to finish this, and then we'll go into introducing our esteemed guest panelists. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this. And so I hope you guys had a chance to, look at that and reflect on the different things to consider when choosing your playing surface for your youth. So before I do introduce our esteemed panelists, I do want to acknowledge that where I speak from is the original homelands of the Susquehannock Indian Nation. And we recognize and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. So the first person that I'd like to introduce you to, well, real quick, the order of things that we're going to do is you will be learning about the impacts of APS in climate change, sustainability, cost, maintenance, durability, ADA compliance, health, and we'll hit on ordinances and bans and a few other iterations in between. These are some of the organizations and groups that are representing our speakers today. So Dr. Sarah Evans is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Medicine and Climate Science and is a member of the Institute for Climate Change and Environmental Health and the episomics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And she focuses her research on the impacts of early life environmental exposures on the nervous system, development, and child behavior. She's a trusted voice on the health effects of toxic chemicals and what individuals can do to protect their health and how to advocate for healthier policies in the communities. Diane Wolfe is a board member of Safe and Healthy Playing Fields. She is a retired from the advanced practice nurse midwifery and a public health nurse with a Bachelor of Science from San Diego University. She also has her certification in midwifery from the University of Southern California School of Medicine and an MSN and a USC School of Nursing. And she spent nearly 3 decades in the clinical practice as a clinical professor, mentoring nurses and medical students as residences. She has practiced in California and Latvia and has lived in Mexico, Tijuana, and Korea. Our next guest speaker is unable to be with us today, so she had something she needed to take care of. Kyla Bennett is the Science Policy Director for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. She leads efforts to advocate for stronger environmental protections and hold regulatory agencies accountable. With a biology and environmental law background, Kyla brings a unique and powerful perspective to her work, addressing critical issues like PFAS, contamination, pushing for comprehensive policies to safeguard public health and the environment. Her work at PEER is marked by her commitment to transparency, her support for whistleblowers who expose environmental violations. And Kristen Dubin is a community organizer at Beyond Plastic, and she's a grassroots organizer, artist, former educator who became enamored with policy, graduating with a master's degree from University of New Hampshire, Carsey School of Public Policy in 2022. She has been committed volunteer with Surfrider Foundation New Hampshire chapter for several years and serves as both an executive committee member and campaign coordinator. She believes local action is where it's at, especially when tackling the intersectional issue of plastics. And Jeff, were you able to get on today? Hopefully. Jeff, is he here? Christina?
I
Nash?
don't see him on. No.
Okay, well, then we'll skip him for now. If he's able to get on at the time he's at the end of our presenters, I'll introduce them at that time. All right. So our first speaker is Kyla Bennett.
Thank you so much. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how PFAS and the microplastics and chemicals from artificial turf impact your community. Can I have the next slide, please? So before we can really delve into what the problems are with artificial turf, you have to understand what it is. Most artificial turf comes with a shock pad, which makes it soft for the athletes when they fall or crash into it. Then there's a rubber plastic backing to which these plastic blades of fake grass are sewn. And then there's something called infill, which can be a variety of different substances. The green blades are called the carpet, but the infill is very important. And there are many, many different types of infill. That infill helps hold those blades upright. So as you can see here in this picture, there are several different types of infill. For decades, we only had the one on the very top, which is that black crumb rubber, which is typically from used tires that would otherwise go to landfill. So they're just torn up into tiny little pieces, and it's called crumb rubber infill. Because people started getting very nervous about the variety of chemicals and lead that are in this crumb rubber, they started to turn to what they call more organic, quote unquote, infill, things made from cork, from walnut shells, from olive pits. They also use recycled sneakers. You can see that on the bottom right, and on the left, there are these little rubber encapsulated grains of sand. So while I think that crumb rubber is by far the worst type of infill from an environmental and a health perspective, they're all bad because the turf itself is bad. Next slide, please. And why is that? Well, back in 2019, I was one of the two scientists that discovered PFAS, which is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, in the blades of the fake grass. Jeff Gearhart from the Ecology Center and I decided to test some turf, and we found concerning levels of PFAS in the blades. At first, the industry denied it. Now they admit it. Now they're lying and saying they no longer have PFAS in the blades. But I can tell you that every single brand that we have tested and that others have tested does indeed have concerning levels of PFAS, including about 3/4 of them have PFOS, which is one of the most dangerous and well-studied types of PFAS. Next slide, please. So what is wrong with this fake grass system? First of all, they break off. Even though industry will tell you this doesn't happen, these grades of fake grass and the infill emit microplastics and nanoplastics. And these small, tiny pieces of plastic can affect both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Specifically, microplastics in soil can decrease soil fertility. They result in the loss of microbiomes. And earthworms can actually carry these microplastics and nanoplastics from the surface to deeper substrates, which can impact nutrient storage, cycling, and also greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And these microplastics and nanoplastics can transfer from one trophic level from the next. So in other words, once these microplastics and nanoplastics are in the soil, they get eaten by earthworms and other small animals. They get taken up by plants, they get eaten by other animals, and eventually they can get into our bodies. Next slide, please. These microplastics and nanoplastics are dangerous to both human and wildlife health. And so like PFAS, there are 3 routes of exposure for these microplastics and nanoplastics: ingestion, inhalation, and dermal absorption. And all of these can lead to a range of health issues, including respiratory disorders, cancer, neurological symptoms, and disturbance of gut microbia. If you read the news these days, you'll see that we are finding microplastics in placental blood, in our brains, in our testes, everywhere. So it's just ubiquitous. Next slide, please. Now, the crumb rubber, as you remember, I said, is probably the most dangerous of the infill options. And the reason is that these used tires, or even the virgin rubber, contain numerous carcinogens. They contain a lot of lead, zinc, and other toxic chemicals. And in particular, they contain something called 6-PPD, which kills some species of fish, particularly salmon. So if it's that toxic to fish, you can only imagine that it's toxic to people and other wildlife as well. So as I said, even if you use organic infills, artificial turf is dangerous. This is a picture of the Boston Globe article that broke the news about the artificial turf containing PFAS. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we got mixed up here. They're not in order. So keep scrolling. Go to the next one, please. Next one. Next one. There we go. Part of the problem is that artificial turf, contrary to what industry tells us, is considered impervious by EPA, by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so this is a picture from West Virginia. It's an artificial turf field under all that water after the rain bomb, which we're getting, as you know, more and more frequently because of climate change. These surfaces are considered as impervious as asphalt and need to be considered as such when you're doing stormwater calculations. But part of the problem is that when these big storms come, it's going to take all of those microplastics and nanoplastics and PFAS, and that water is going to be full of all those chemicals and those plastics. And what happens is that water goes into groundwater, drinking water, and also surface waters, and can lead to things like do not eat advisories. This is a sign from Michigan, where there's so much PFAS found in the fish that they have done do not eat advisories. You'll notice on this sign that they say, please enjoy swimming. Touching the water is not a health concern. This is false. This is not true. A fairly recent peer-reviewed article found that even the long-chain PFAS, like PFOA, can be dermally absorbed. And again, the routes of exposure for both PFAS and microplastics and nanoplastics are ingestion, inhalation, and dermal absorption. So you should not be swimming in water bodies that are full of PFAS-laden water. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, artificial turf is simply not worth the risk. And one of my favorite quotes from Carl Sagan is, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So in other words, just because we haven't studied something yet, or we haven't found harm because we haven't looked, does not mean it's safe. And the industry relies on this all the time. There are over 10,000 PFAS, for example. Some people say there are more, like millions of them, depending on how you define them. We only have toxicity information on about 30 of them. So just because we don't yet have that toxicity information does not mean that those toxic chemicals are safe. It just means that we don't know yet. And I firmly believe that we should be invoking the precautionary principle because we're talking about human health and the environment. You have to keep in mind that artificial turf is a fossil fuel product. There is no place for these fake grass fields in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. You guys make sure you're putting your questions as we go along in the chat, and we will answer them after our panelists have kind of given everybody information, so your understanding is the same. But just got a little lag here. I'm not sure why it's not changing. There it goes. So Tamara, who was unable to be here, I did want to mention that the CDC says that these artificial playing surfaces contribute to about 7% of are the 7th biggest lead exposure to our youth. And their new regulations state that there's no safe level of lead for youth and individuals' blood. So artificial turf is made from various fibers plastic fibers, nylon, polyethylene, and they will contain lead as well as the paint to give the pretty coloration in these poured in place. And you can ask more clarifying questions to our expert panelists later on problems with lead exposure, and I'm sure they'll be able to answer you further. All right, so next we have just discussing with us our guest panelist, Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Tamala. So I'm just going to briefly present some of the concerns that we have specifically related to artificial turf and children's health. I'm going to try not to repeat the information that Kyla just provided. You can go to the next slide. So at Mount Sinai, I work with a team of researchers and pediatricians who study the impact of environmental exposures on children's health and well-being. And so together with our research institute and our pediatric environmental health specialty unit, our statewide New York Centers for Excellence in Children's Health, and with support that we get from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, we apply our research findings to improve the health of patients and communities. And so because of our expertise in the area of children's health and the environment, we at Mount Sinai have been responding to community concerns about artificial turf dating back for nearly 2 decades now. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly review why children are vulnerable to exposures on, you can go back up one, or it doesn't matter. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why children are most vulnerable to exposures on turf. I'm going to touch a little bit on chemical exposures in addition to what Dr. Bennett already talked about. I'm going to mention some findings from an EPA study that was recently completed, and then I'll touch a little bit on what we know about injuries and abrasions that happen on artificial turf. Next slide, please. So in environmental pediatrics, we have a saying that children are not little adults. Can you go back up one? Because their normal behavior and their physiology predisposes them to experience some of the highest exposures to environmental factors. They're closer to the ground than adults are. They tend to roll around, get dirty, put their hands in their mouths. They are also less able to regulate their body temperature than adults are, and less likely to drink when they become thirsty and dehydrated. And they breathe more rapidly than adults. So they're more likely to take in more air pollutants than a full-grown adult would. And all of those factors really combine to put them at risk to greater chemical exposures when they play on artificial turf. Next slide, please. And so it's not surprising that when the CDC conducts studies that they conduct every other year on a representative sample of the US population, that children experience some of the highest chemical exposures of anyone in the US, and with over 200 chemicals detected in their blood and their urine. And a number of these chemicals we know are present in artificial turf and in other consumer products that we use. Next slide, please. So what are all these chemicals that are present in turf, and what are their health impacts? And so I've just organized a very small number of them. I'll show you data from the EPA that, along with others, has identified more than 300 chemicals that are present in turf. And so this is just a short list. So some of these are known to cause cancer in humans. Some of these are neurotoxicants. You just heard about lead from Tamala. Some of them interfere with our reproductive systems. These are things like plasticizers, phthalates, also the microplastics that you just heard about, or respiratory irritants when they're inhaled. So off-gassing of VOCs, emission of particulate matter, and dust that can come off of the field. So all 3 routes of exposure that we think about: inhalation of chemicals and particles, contact with the skin, or even absorption of chemicals through the skin or open wounds, and ingestion of turf particles, often accidental, but even intentional when you have very small children playing on the turf surface. So these chemicals can get into the body through all of these routes of exposure. Next slide, please. So because of concerns about all of these chemicals that were known to be present, particularly in the recycled tire, crumb rubber infill that Dr. Bennett already mentioned, back in 2016, the US EPA, along with the CDC and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, launched a federal study. And the rationale behind this was, according to the EPA, studies to date have limitations and do not comprehensively evaluate the concerns about health risks from exposure to tire, crumb rubber. These studies have taken many years to complete. I'll give you a little bit of information about what they found and also what they didn't look at. But in the meantime, even given all of these concerns, these fields continue to be installed all across the United States. Next slide, please. So this was a multi-part study. I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, and if there are questions, we can talk about this further. But what they did was they looked at the literature to see what we know and what we don't know. Not surprisingly, because we already knew, they identified 350 chemicals approximately that were present in the recycled tire, crumb rubber. They found that there were no studies really on humans to understand what the health impacts might be. They also, again, they confirmed the presence of many of these hazardous chemicals, but they found that they really only had toxicity data for about half of the chemicals that they identified. So for about half of the chemicals, we really don't know what they do when humans are exposed. And then lastly, they did a very small exposure characterization study. There were a few players involved in this, very few chemicals that were looked at. They did not look at PFAS chemicals. So this study was designed only to look at recycled tire, crumb rubber, not the chemicals that are present in the grass blades or other components of the fields. Didn't look at heat or injury, which we'll talk a little bit more about within this panel. And this did not constitute a risk assessment. So for those of you who are talking about the installation of turf fields within your communities and hearing about this federal turf study, and you may be hearing that industry says that this is evidence of safety, according to the US EPA's own conclusion from the study, it is important to note that the study activities completed as part of this multi-agency research effort were not designed and are not sufficient by themselves to directly answer questions about potential health risks. So the findings from this study are not evidence of safety for play on these surfaces. Next slide, please. And so going a little bit beyond, just to touch on other infills. So recycled tire, crumb rubber is one, but many communities, because they know that they contain chemicals of concern, are looking for alternative infills. And this is just a study that was conducted by our colleagues at UMass Lowell, along with my colleague at Mount Sinai, Homero Harari, who looked at the composition of other alternative infills and found that they all contain some chemicals of concern as well. So it's very difficult to say that there's a better infill when you're looking at turf. And as Dr. Bennett also already mentioned, there are chemicals of concern present in the grass blades, the matting, the carpet, the other components, which are not resolved by the use of an alternative infill. Next slide, please. And so to just quickly talk about injuries and abrasions, athletes who play on these fields are more likely to get what is called turf burn. So these are skin abrasions. We think that these will increase the risk of chemical exposures. This is an image of a U.S. women's soccer player several years ago now, who advocated and finally won a lawsuit to be permitted to play on grass. But you can see how the crumb rubber really accumulates in that turf burn open wounds, and that's a direct bloodstream exposure. There have also been studies that show that because these abrasions and cuts are more common, there's more likely to be infection, including MRSA infection. There are a number of studies that have looked at foot, ankle, and knee injuries, and I'm sure many of you have seen in the popular press as of late that the NFL Players Association is actually advocating for play on natural grass because play on artificial turf is so hard on their bodies, and they're experiencing more rotational injuries of the foot, ankle, and knee. And then lastly, we have concerns about concussion, which are largely dependent on how well the field is maintained as well. You can go to the next slide, please. And so because these fields, many communities install them because they think that they are lower maintenance than artificial grass. They actually do require a fair bit of maintenance. They need to have the infill replaced. They need to be tested for hardness periodically, depending on what kind of play and how frequent the play is happening. And so there's a very real risk when these fields are not properly tested and checked and maintained, that there will be more injuries and more concussions. 1 in 6 sports concussions are due to impact of the head to the surface. And there are some studies that have shown an increased risk of concussion when playing on artificial turf, particularly in colder temperatures when the field gets harder. Next slide, please. And so lastly, I just want to point out, and we'll probably hear more of this throughout the panel as well, that we're very concerned about some of the indirect health effects that come from the accelerating climate change, to which artificial turf surfaces are a contributor. These are petroleum-based. I think Dr. Bennett already mentioned this. They form heat islands, which we'll hear more about. They heat not only the surface, but the air around and the communities that directly surround artificial turf surfaces. They increase the risk of flooding, and they emit greenhouse gases throughout their lifespan. So all the way from manufacture to the time of their disposal, they're releasing greenhouse gases. And we know that there are a number of health effects that are associated with climate change. Next slide, please. I think I'm coming to the end. Right, so I just wanted to share resources. We can share these again in the chat, but if you want to take a picture of the QR code, this will link you to our resources from Mount Sinai that are related to artificial turf. And you can also find us on social media if you want to get frequent updates. Next slide. And this will just link you to an ongoing study and community partnership that we at Mount Sinai have with several organizations who are trying to answer some of the unknown questions about exposures and health risks that occur when we play on turf surfaces. And again, that QR code will take you to that page as well, so you can explore some of what's there. And I believe that is it for me for now.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Evans. That was wonderful. So next we have Diane Wilkie, and she will talk to us about the heat impacts, maintenance, and costs.
I guess that means I have to unmute. Good morning. Thanks for putting this together, Tamala. I'm in California. We have 2 other of our board members from Montgomery County, Maryland, also on the call. I wanted to talk briefly about the temperature impact of plastic playing surfaces. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see this is what's called PIP, or poured in place used tire crumb surfacing, that is frequently used on playground surfaces. We recently had some success in California with the California Coastal Commission prohibiting this from use on a playground, an elementary school playground on the beach in Newport Beach, California. The picture on the right, the 200.3 degrees, was recently taken in June on a 105-degree day in Los Gatos, California. And that is a crumb rubber surface. They're planning on replacing this field. They're talking about alternative infills, but the claims about alternative infills reducing temperature is only based on reports. It's not based on science. And in fact, plant-based infills requires a lot of water. 3,200 gallons for a regulation size field every 3 to 4 days is what the industry is recommending. The 177 degrees was on a field in the Phoenix area a couple of years ago on a 110-degree day. And then the heat island effect is enormous with these fields. They're so large. With a regulation sized field, they're visible from satellites in space. And this, in fact, is a field in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Amazon Crocker field that was recently replaced. They initially had crumb rubber. They used a plant-based infill, I believe this time, claiming it would make things cooler. And in fact, you can see it did not. Burns happen very quickly on these surfaces, very quickly. And at 118 degrees, you can get a full thickness skin burn within 20 minutes. But at 140 degrees, you can get a full thickness burn in 5 seconds. And the hottest temperature recorded was in Australia at, I believe, 226 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide. Next slide, Tamala. This is actually a natural grass playing field. There are multiple natural grass sportsplexes. This one happens to be in Scottsdale, Arizona. They also exist in Las Vegas. Recently in California, we've been seeing ads for a natural grass golf course in Death Valley, California. Next slide. We have documented cases that where PFAS has been shown to leach off of plastic playing fields. We have testing results from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and now from concerned citizens in Burville, Rhode Island. Next slide. When the industry is approaching different jurisdictions, school boards, cities, counties about installing plastic, they're not revealing the entire cost, the true costs. We know that for a new field, it's probably been several years where I've seen anything much lower than $1.2 million for a new plastic field. If you add things like colors, logos, longer fibers for the blades, that's going to boost the cost. If you have to buy new maintenance equipment, that can add tens of thousands of dollars. A lot of times they're trying to encourage you to buy a maintenance agreement because by and large, these plastic fields are not being maintained. And in fact, as soon as they're rolled out, you can void a warranty by not maintaining them properly. Plant-based infill is generally 4 times the cost of used tire crumb. GMAX testing is for safety, for hardness testing of a field. That's running approximately $1,500 every year. And that's only if it passes the test, is it once a year. If it fails the testing, which the parameters vary depending on who you listen to, then the field needs to be closed down, the infill needs to be replenished, and before the field should be reopened again. And in fact, that's not even happening in most instances. Infill replacement is about 1.5 to 5 tons per year. Repairs can be costly, and you need to know that these plastic fields are going to cost you dearly in terms of water. We know that to manufacture a square meter of synthetic turf is about 989 gallons of water is required. You need to clean the fields. If you're going to keep your warranty intact, you need to cool it off to a safe, playable playing temperature. That cooling effect only lasts about 20 to 50 minutes. And plant-based infill is about 3,200 gallons every 3 to 4 days, and that's per the industry. It's going to cost dearly to remove these fields, to transport them and dispose of them. And we're finding anywhere between $55,000 and $60,000 every 8 to 10 years on average. And then of course you need to buy more plastic carpet. There is no recycling. Despite industry claims, it's been debunked. They're being dumped on agricultural land. The top right-hand photo is in Escondido, California, where a field was dumped behind a second high school. And recently we found fields warehoused. We found synthetic turf from 3 different communities warehoused in New Jersey. Next slide. We know that natural grass fields, you can have 3 to 4 natural grass fields for the price of 1 synthetic field. Recently, there was an expert panel that was held on the 30th of May of this year. And this is information that I compiled from the various expert grass managers. And these are people that have been doing this for 40 plus years in many instances and truly were a wealth of information. You're not going to be able to install, maintain, repair, replace, test, refill the infill, and certainly add water to your plastic grass, which I forgot to mention, has to be potable water for plastic. because recycled water will damage the plastic because of the higher salt content. You're not going to get anywhere near $43,000 a year that it would cost you for a high-end, high-use natural grass field. Next slide. That's somebody else's. Tamara, is this somebody else's slide? Okay. Communities across the country are getting fed up with the heat island effect, the burns, the temperatures on these fields, as well as the chemical exposure and the plastic waste. This is in conjunction with non-toxic communities. We've been putting together a map where there's moratoriums. In some instances, battles have been won by referendum votes on ballots, and we've got more and more states enacting laws. Next slide. Not sure whose this is.
Pamela, you're on mute.
I think this is going on to Christina's slide. I don't have any others for you right now, Diane.
Okay.
They might be moved toward the end.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Diane, for that information. So our last panelist is here to talk to us about, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and let her load up her slides and do a screen share about what communities can do if they don't want these synthetic playing surfaces in their communities. And there's various different iterations that you can integrate all the way to federal state bans. And she'll talk to us more about that. Thanks, Christina.
Sure. So most often community members are playing defense. They don't find out about a potential synthetic turf installation until there's an upcoming vote on a bond resolution or ordinance, or the school board has already approved it. And, they're chasing it. And essentially, we're playing whack-a-mole across the country, and we have to. But it's impossible to get ahead when you're just chasing it. So simultaneously, we have to respond to these installations as they pop up, and at the same time, play the long game by getting local and state bills passed that prohibit the installation of synthetic turf. And there's three major routes to do that. One is a moratorium. So this is a pause on any new installations while a study takes place, typically anywhere 2 to 5 years. It can be extended. So this is a really great way to buy some time, and it can lead to a full ban, which ideally is going to prohibit any kind of synthetic turf with any kind of infill. And, we have seen some that only ban turf with crumb rubber infill, which was referred to earlier, but we really want to widen that out to all. So here's some places where moratoriums are in place. And some places where there are bans in place. And I'm sure Diane will follow up on the California places in the question and answers part of the program. But California passed a bill that allows cities and counties to ban artificial turf. So we expect to see more from them. Another approach is to ban PFAS. And right now, and essentially it's, how do we say synthetic turf without saying synthetic turf? And, currently we're seeing this language for intentionally added PFAS. And I think, Dr. Kyla Bennett can speak to this more a bit later. And then here are some states that have these laws in place. And again, we can talk more about that. But I just want to quickly, as I want to leave enough time here for Q&A, show you where we have some models on the Beyond Plastics website. If you go under the ACT tab and into our campaign toolkits, we have a sample local moratorium, a sample state moratorium, and then a model state or local ban for artificial turf. And we'll be updating this webpage to more of kind of a user-friendly step-by-step toolkit, knowing that, of course, turf fights are very specific to that location. And, we'll continue to upload recordings here at the end of that page. Tamala, we can certainly put this one up there once you have it. And one of our activists donated this image that they created for anyone to use on social media or as a poster. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Christina. That's wonderful. So does anyone know if Jeff was able to get on? As he's our last guest panelist to talk to us about alternatives. No notice. All right. So if any of our panelists have anything that they want to add about the natural grass or the alternatives, feel free to do so. For poured in place or tiles or playgrounds, you would want to be using engineered wood fibers. And for the artificial turf fields, of course, ideally you would want to use organic grass fields, natural grass. Otherwise, we will start opening it up to questions. Diane, we'll begin with you. Go ahead and take yourself off mute.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Tamala, for pulling this together. And thank you to Christina and Diane and Dr. Evans and all of you, Kyla, for your expertise and your consistent persistence with this. I'm president of Montgomery. It's called Safe Healthy Playing Fields. We're a national 501c3. We're all volunteer. And I guess I want to make 2 points. 3. One is, first, again, thank you. Second is we are a 501c3 all volunteer and would love to have your support and contributions to maintain our work supporting communities around the country. That's how we found our way to Diane Wolke. And that's how we found our way to many of the communities mentioned in Massachusetts who were just scavenging when they found themselves on defense for something online. We are desperately in need of some IT website type support. And then the third thing, which is correct, a question is if I could have some of the experts just really talk about messaging, which you mentioned a bit at the end in terms of defense and offense and bans versus moratoriums. Instead of talking about banning something, but really talking about, instead of a ban against something, we want to be for something. We want to be in favor of safety. We want to be in favor of freedom from PFAS. We want to be in favor of things. We want to be for something. And so any conversation about messaging on that without making us sound like, we're dancing around in circles under the moon or something. Thank you.
I'll just say something, Diana, I think that's akin to talking about reuse and refill versus, right, talking about, don't use single-use plastic, don't use this. And I totally agree with you. We have to do both. And I think it's always it depends on which setting we're in, who are we talking to, who's our audience in terms of what we use. But I do absolutely, a lot of our groups are looking for more organizations and experts in organic management of natural fields and want to get them to come speak. Yeah, I think we need to see more of that for sure.
I'm sorry, I'm going to unmute myself and just say there's an organization called Turf Grass Producers International, TPI, and they are an international group specifically about grass, and that means everything from cemeteries and college campuses to front yards to sports fields. But they've become an ally, and they've recently become what's called a checkoff program. Christina, if you're familiar with that, it's the same USDA program that allows, if you think about Got Milk, That
Mhm.
campaign was created once the dairy industry created a federal checkoff program, or beef, it's what's for dinner, or pork, the other white meat. We all know these campaigns because once these industries took themselves into that category, they were able to generate a massive amount of money and market. And that's been always the problem, is that plastic fields are a plug and play around the country, and each grass field is different from one side of a state to another. And it is my hope that TPI is really going to be able to help us with that marketing. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you, Diane. Astrid, you want to ask your question or comment?
Hello. Oh, I just wanted to share some of the questions from earlier. Somebody was asking if we could share Sarah Evans' slides. And there's another question about a person said that in their town used a broke infill, pine pellets coated with plastics. And they're wondering if how can they counter that this is a safe infill? And
Yeah,
there,
question. It's Brock. It's called Brock infill. It's white pine that's coated with some kind of plastic coating. Everybody in the water, I live in Watertown, Massachusetts. Many of the people on this call are familiar with this story, but I could not convince the town that this was not a safe infill. Everybody is so focused on replacing the crumb tire infill with something organic, as they call it. But it's still toxic. But I think what we really need to do is educate. We need to educate the parents, school committees, teachers, DPW departments, Parks and Rec departments. We need to be doing it constantly so that when, you know, a city or town decides they want to install, or a college or university install an artificial turf field, that everybody is ready to counter it with real facts and the fact that grass is much better.
Also with Brockville, Oak Bluffs did a study where they tested the Brockville for a number of toxic chemicals. And not only did it have PFAS, I believe, but it also had some heavy metals. But again, I think the best thing to do is to remind people that it doesn't matter what infill you put in. You can put in organic tapioca beads. It doesn't matter. It's the rest of the system that's, I mean, you know, the infill is bad, but the rest of the system in some sense is worse. So it's just a red herring.
Yeah, that's something that people don't realize, is that plastic is it absorbs all the other chemicals around it, and they cling to it. Everything from viruses to bacteria to heavy metals, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, you name it. They'll everything clings to it. Think about when you go to, you know, you put your storage into a Tupperware or plastic bin, right? And then how you see the film, you know, clings to it. So just think about billions of blades of grass, and all these chemicals are clinging to it. And then when they shed off into the environment, the more and more it breaks down, the larger and larger the surface area is, and the more chemical and other toxicities can get on to those microplastics and spread everywhere.
I would also just jump in to add that alternative infills have the same issue of heat exposure. So every type of infill that's been tested gets much hotter than natural grass. And that's really because the grass blades, natural grass transpires and cools naturally, and the plastic blades will not do that. So, so there's a very real concern about heat exposures, regardless of what type of infill you choose.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Our field had to be shut down this summer because it got too hot. They actually put a warning. They had to put a warning sign on the fence surrounding the field. So thank you.
Christina and Astrid, are there other questions in the chat?
There is one from
Kathleen,
Ellen.
you wanted to make a comment here. Go ahead, Kathleen, and then we'll get. Kathleen, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So since Dr. Fowler unfortunately wasn't here, I'm a neuroscientist, not a natural field expert, but having worked on this issue for over 15 years now, I've talked to a lot of them. So just to reiterate that natural grass fields can be constructed and engineered to be almost rainout proof, especially with modern grasses and drought proof. So, both ends of the spectrum. If the soils are engineered correctly, correct drainage is put in, and modern grasses, which, span the spectrum from being able to take more wetter climates, transitional climates, and drier climates. And there was a question in the chat, and this actually has happened going from my phone just closed down. Sorry. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes. We can hear you, Kathleen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Kathleen, we can hear you. Yeah, what Kathleen was saying is, you can make your soil drain well, and depending on the slope and the cross slope, and this is not just for a field, but for a playground, using engineered wood fibers as well. I know that was one of the big reasons is puddles, why our local municipality installed a port in place was because of puddling. And all they needed to do was to change the slope and cross slope. And you can put engineered wood fiber down with packing it, and it will even be ADA compliant. So you don't need to use port in place to get ADA compliance. And not sure where Kathleen went, but Christina, you had some questions that you identified in the chat.
Yeah, so there's one from Ellen. If somebody wants to speak to any fields that were transitioned back to natural grass from artificial turf.
I only know of a couple. I'd be happy to hop in.
Yeah, please.
The only ones that I know of are the ones that are somewhat high profile. I believe it was the Arkansas Razorbacks. And in about 2016, the Baltimore Ravens went back at the request of the players from plastic to grass. And that's right about when I was being brought on board by Kathy, who created a lot of this vortex that I'm in here, Kathy Michaels, who was just on. And they went back at the request of the players, and the owner went along with it. And as is typical in these cases, they took out their plastic field and gave it with great pomp and circumstance to a local high school who got to play on like a pro field. I mean, it's just one of these tragic, and you'll see that a lot. We've actually seen that several times since then. It's not like we're looking for it. But the articles interviewing the players as they came off after their first practice on the grass field, totally unsolicited comments about my knees feel great. This is so much cooler. I feel so much better. This is just wonderful surface to play on, so much better for my body. And I hope people saw, I put in the chat earlier, the 1977 Congressional Select Committee report reporting on the fact that NFL Players Association was already complaining about the plastic as too hot and too damaging and destroying their careers and their earning power.
Diana, I just wanted to follow up because I posed the question. Thank you for your answer. If I might add here, my question is more about remediation. Given that these are hazardous materials, and normally, if hazardous materials like those in these artificial turf fields were dumped anywhere or placed anywhere or accidentally spilled anywhere, they would have a designation perhaps of
Yeah, Ellen, I can save you your breath, and the answer is if we're letting them put them in for children on purpose in full daylight, taking them out and dumping them in the woods is hardly going to get anybody's legal
no,
police.
that I'm just asking if in any of those cases that you're talking about where there's a transition back to natural grass fields, were there any steps taken by those entities to actually try to remediate in some fashion? Are they removing further beyond the removal of the fields, the plastic and the infill? Are they taking any steps that you're aware of, extra steps to maybe remove a few feet of soil so that there's a certain level of remediation? That's what I was referring to. Thank you.
I understand.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification. And the answer is I've never heard of any such thing. And given all the other sort of higher priority ways of mitigating the toxicity from these fields, I guess that would be a little bit further down, but not to my knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that you are destroying the microbiome level completely when you put one of these playing surfaces on there. And it does take decades to build it back. You will have to haul in new topsoil because in order to install a lot of these, you have to rip off the topsoil in order to have a very flat level ground, because any cushion or migration dipping in the ground will lead to the playing, whether it's poured in place or artificial turf, to subside more than it does already, which it does. And some of the things too, in regards to maintenance, is it should be washed weekly. It should be, raked. They've got to put down fungicides on it, a bunch of other things. I'm sure Diane and Kathleen can go over the litany of things that they were talking about in order to uphold the warranty. So I'll go ahead and let Kathleen Michaels jump on. Try again, Kathleen.
Yeah, sorry, my phone unexpectedly shut down while I was talking last time, so I'm not sure where I left off. But just on the replacement issue, there were two things. I think what I was saying when my phone shut down is there was a question about the cost of going back from synthetic turf to grass, and it actually turns out, so since a number of places have done that, the cost to go from grass back to synthetic turf back to grass is about the same as putting in a new synthetic turf or replacement synthetic turf. And so the advantage is once you do that, you never have to replace again if you go to grass, whereas the synthetic turf is only going to last about 8 years. And then to the toxics, that's a very, very good question about remediation. And just kind of ironically, one of the California school meetings where they were trying to decide whether to replace the synthetic turf or go back to grass, one of the rationales used for not going back to grass was that then they would have to treat the site as a hazardous waste site, which is totally ironic because they were essentially admitting that the current synthetic turf field was toxic, and yet this is what they're having their students play on and proposing to put another toxic field on top of that. And so I just found that so ironic and totally to the point of that question. And no, they admitted it there, and I don't know if they had gone back to grass, would they have gone through the trouble of trying to do testing and remediation? And now at that point in time, I don't think we knew about PFAS. I forget what the timeline was on that particular call, but now knowing what we know about PFAS, obviously that the that is one liability issue that we try to bring up to all the parks and school districts, that, you know, once they put the stuff in, they may be liable for the PFAS contamination that they create.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. Diane.
Yeah, Kathleen, we did know about PFAS then, but the field that you're referencing was in Albany, California, which is on the San Francisco Bay, north of Oakland, over a creek that drains into the bay. And yes, they were replacing a crumb rubber field with more used higher crumb, and claimed that they didn't want it known that they were going to be putting more crumb rubber over the creek. But they did do it, and it is not considered hazardous waste in California. We're hoping that will change, and I can talk more about that down the road with other slides. But I wanted to mention, as far as remediation of the soil, it's something that we know that we need to be looking at the living biomass to determine what type of amendments are needed in addition to topsoil. And it's something that is going to be looked at much more closely here in the Los Angeles area north of me. And again, there's a slide that I can talk more about that later. We're hoping to have big stuff going on here in LA very soon.
Great, thank you. So Astrid, you have some more questions from the chat for us.
Oh no, this was my question.
Oh, okay, ask away.
Yes, I was wondering because they, I think Diana, but I'm not sure, had said that there were concerning levels of PFAS on artificial turf. I was just wondering if you have like the concentrations by any chance.
I said that, and they range depending on which PFAS you're talking about, and also, so we're talking about hundreds to thousands of parts per trillion of targeted PFAS, but we also do total organic fluorine, and there's a lot of PFAS in there that we can't measure because in a targeted way, because we don't know what the chemical formulas are. So we can only test for about 70 PFAS individually. Heather Whitehead, who used to work in Graham Peasley's lab at Notre Dame University, has a paper coming out with Graham, hopefully this winter, that talks about the levels that they found. They tested 37 different brands and found PFAS in every single one of them. But the bottom line is that EPA has said there is no safe dose of at least two PFAS, PFOS and PFOA, and more than 3/4 of the turf tested by Heather and Graham had PFOS. So, you know, any amount is of concern. But we are seeing, I am seeing consistently hundreds of parts per trillion of various PFAS.
Great. Are there more questions or comments for our
Okay, well,
panel?
there's one in the chat here from Peg, asking if there's other state environmental agencies other than in New Jersey that have issued technical memos on artificial turf. Does anyone know?
There are some
Rhode
old
Island.
from the state of Washington, Connecticut. They've done some old ones, but that they were all done based on crumb rubber and before we discovered PFAS in the turf in 2019. So I don't know of any. And the problem is that lobbyists, the chemical industry lobbyists they are routinely going to even municipal hearings and state hearings on some of these things. They're the ones pushing the intentionally added language, which is a huge loophole for them to continue to using PFAS in artificial turf. So you have to be very, very careful, but the states and the municipalities have been hoodwinked by the industry.
Thank you. Any other questions for our panelists?
I think there's a question from Anna Grossman.
Okay, Anna, you want to come off mute and ask, or?
Hi, thank you for holding this webinar. I'm from Montclair, New Jersey. We just saw acres of artificial turf being installed. Our Board of Education said that it was PFAS-free artificial turf, and of course, I now know that is not even possible. And I tested the artificial turf, and the results were exactly what Kyla and others have mentioned. The total fluorine was high, and there is therefore evidence of PFAS in it. And I just wanted to sort of alert people who are being told by their Board of Ed or their town that there's no PFAS in the artificial turf, that everything you're hearing in this webinar is real. And the lab doesn't lie, and it is what it is. So now we have acres of PFAS and outside my window. And even today, they're bringing in even more. That said, I just saw the report from Silent Spring that was submitted to the to the California's Toxic Substances Control Agency, and that's alarming. There's so many other chemicals. So while we also are, we're focused on PFAS, I'm now, it's not just PFAS. And so that was just more of a comment, and it's just echoing what other people have said. And I just wanted to know if there's anything else that advocates on the ground could be doing. We're collecting temperatures, we're testing the material, we're pushing back, we're trying to bring the science to people who have never even thought about this topic. Is there anything else that we could be doing?
One of the reasons we focus on PFAS, Anna, is because it is being regulated now. And we do know that it leaches off and gets into drinking water, like Burville, Rhode Island found, and what we've seen in Portsmouth and in Connecticut, and in my town here in Easton, Massachusetts. So I still think that the PFAS and the microplastics are good angles to go after, but also keep in mind that when an industry representative, and I'm sure there are some on this call listening, when they say that they have PFAS free, or they even put that in the contract, they will send you a lab report if you ask. And when you look at that lab report, you have to be super careful, because what they do is they set the detection limits for PFAS in the parts per million, or sometimes the parts per billion, and say nothing to see here. But of course, PFAS is regulated in the parts per trillion. It has an MCLG of 0 for certain PFAS. So parts per billion, parts per million are not sufficient. Those tests are designed to not detect the PFAS. But then again, just focusing on the PFAS, because it's so easy to manipulate these data, is difficult to do. You have to word things very carefully in your contract if they're going to be saying PFAS free. The other thing they do is they say, oh, well, you took a sample after we laid it down. It was from the air, it was from the rain, it was from your clothing, it was from whatever. So you need to find out what brand they're going to be installing and get a sample directly from the manufacturer. But I think, we have to start talking about the microplastics and the nanoplastics, because even if they do come up with a PFAS-free alternative someday, they're never going to get away from the microplastics. I mean, this is a fossil fuel plastic product. So that's something that we should be hammering home all the time. And also, it's a lie when they say these things are being recycled or that they're recyclable. They're not. They burn them in Baytown, Texas at ExxonMobil's pyrolysis plant. So, or they end up in some farmer's field in Philadelphia, or in a warehouse in New Jersey, or in a wetland in Franklin, Mass, wherever. They just get dumped. They are not recycled. So I think hitting them also with the climate change, the heat islands, we just have to keep hammering away. And I think getting the states to pass a ban like New York has done, doesn't go into effect until 2026, but it's better than nothing. There were bills in California. It passed. Governor Newsom vetoed it. There was a bill in Massachusetts that never came out of committee. But getting the states to ban them on a statewide basis is the best thing we can do. And I think the fact that this is plastic and there's so much attention on plastic right now, I think that's where we should be focusing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The other thing that I have learned about communities is that they all have to have a water oh gosh, I'm going to go and forget the exact terminology, but like a climate action plan. They have to have a water plan, and in those plans you can include all these different things. There's the darker side of artificial greening plastic turfs as widespread pollutants of aquatic environments showed that there are 38 pounds of PFAS from one single field, and one drop of PFAS is like an equivalent of in 20 swimming pools toxic. So imagine 38 pounds. But then also, to this article's point, is that they found that artificial turf fibers make up 15% of the meso and microplastic abundance in our rivers, in our oceans, from the runoff of artificial turf fields. So, we know tire crumb and fibers from fabric are the bulk of microplastics in our environments. But now with this study showing 15% is coming from these artificial plane surfaces, that's significant. And like I said, all of these pieces of microplastic are breaking down and have other harmful chemicals in them and are damaging soil substructure and everything else.
I think that 38 pounds that you're citing is organic fluorine, not PFAS. And I think we need to be really careful.
That's true. Yeah.
Because there are substances out there that will fall into that total organic fluorine calculation that are not PFAS, and we want to stay credible.
There's a question from Amanda Maccabi.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yes. I am finding that one of the things that comes back time and again is, frankly, that people don't know how to manage a natural grass field, and they've been burned before, and they don't want to spend any more money on it, or they're saying, well, we have to dump all of these chemicals on it in order to maintain it, to keep it, which of course is also hazardous for the children. So I'm wondering how, if there are additional resources that I'm not aware of to point people to find a reputable, natural grass installer, maintainer. How does one, because I think a lot of people throw up their hands and say, we have to do synthetic turf because we think we are able. It seems simple and easy and straightforward. And of course, we all know that's not the case, but what, practically speaking, how can we offer, solutions with natural grass in mind?
One thing that exists everywhere is every state has an extension office, and the extension office has a lot of supporting documentation for how to install and take care of grass. And then there are a lot of other organizations that will be in your resource toolkit. I'm sure Sarah, she has some on her website too that she pointed. How about the rest of you guys? Do you have some? And we'll make sure to get these resources into the toolkit for everybody.
Curry, the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, has a nice side-by-side comparison of cost and maintenance for natural grass versus artificial turf. And, the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a city of 150,000 people, has all organic grass fields that satisfy the whole city. There are examples out there, but you're right. Most of the buildings and grounds people who work at schools or the DPWs of a municipality, they don't know how to design, build, and maintain a grass field. And so you do have to bring somebody in, and there are good people out there. And the Penn State Extension is a great place. They're a great resource as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I know there are a lot of examples of people who are doing this successfully, but it's a matter of like bringing them onto or someone. So I didn't know if there was any sort of like affiliation or, you know, stamp of approval or like somebody who was sort of vetting, you know, people that actually know how to do this right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's not a lot, like we know we have a lot of people going to get college education to manage golf, you know, golf grass fields. But a lot of the state universities do have and are, you know, also managing sports fields too. So, and they are in every state. So definitely reach out to them. On a private level, there are fewer businesses that are doing that, but we hope that with the push to migrate back to natural turf fields and the importance of it, that will be become more viable. And even like if a county could hire one single person who knows how to manage an organic grass field, and then they would educate and inform the regular you know, maintenance person for, you know, the township or the school. And so you don't have to have necessarily an expert, like every school doesn't need to afford an expert, is what I'm trying to get at. If, as long as, you know, you have one person that knows, hey, you've got to aerate, hey, this is your, you know, take your soil test and here's what your nutrients are, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they have something to look at and someone to call and ask, you know, then you can kind of share that expense of that professional help. All right, well, we're almost done. So I'm going to give us our closeout slides here and just kind of recap where we are. And so basically, we hope you've learned, I don't know what happened here. We hope you've learned enough information to want to understand that. Let me get back to my slide here. Don't know why it backed up on me. There it is. To understand that these artificial playing surfaces impact the climate, and their entire life cycle contributes greenhouse gases. They're not sustainable because they degrade within just the first few years of their installation and need to replace within 8 to 10. They have contaminants that impact our watersheds, create stormwater heat islands, biodiversity loss, and potential and known health and harms as well. Also, the cost and maintenance needs to be factored in with factoring in the actual maintenance. It's not just put it down and leave it alone. And the fact that it has not been proven safe by a third party or regulating body. Real kids need real grass. And that we recommend natural organic grass fields and engineered wood fibers to replace your tile and poured in place. Also, if you do have these fields or any playing field, you should have warning signs. Notice that these warning signs do not have the warnings that we've mentioned. Also, the CDC says that if you play on these synthetic playing surfaces, you should put a towel down in your car, turn your clothes inside out. When you get home, leave your shoes outside, and then go in and wash yourself and your clothes right away. So to me, that would imply that, hey, maybe it's not the safest thing to play on. You should have a certified playground inspector come and take a look at your playground and maintenance it as well. You will be getting this PowerPoint slides, the recording, and a toolkit with all of the resources that have been mentioned today in chat and from all of our wonderful, fabulous guest speakers. And I just want to give a big applaud to them and appreciate them for coming today to help us understand the complexities and the latest science around the artificial playing surfaces. So thank you